I came home from burying my husband to find strangers carrying his furniture out of our front door. I called the sheriff before I even got out of the car. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a cold, blinding rage that burned away every drop of grief left in my chest. There were folding tables set up on our manicured front lawn. Bright neon price tags were slapped across my late husband's hand-carved oak desk, his vintage record collection, and the leather armchair he used to sit in every evening after work. His own mother was standing on the porch with a pink clipboard, shouting directions at two men carrying our living room rug out into the driveway. They were running a full-scale, spontaneous estate sale on my home, while the dirt on my husband's grave was still fresh. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a broken, childless widow who would crumble into a corner and let them strip my life down to the floorboards. But as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I looked at the legal envelope resting on my passenger seat, took a deep breath, and prepared to destroy every single one of them. Before I tell you how this horrific afternoon ended, follow my story until the end and comment the city or country you are watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. My name is Nicole. I am 38 years old, and 3 days ago, I buried the love of my life, David. We had been married for 12 incredible years. David was a brilliant civil engineer who had built a successful structural consulting firm from scratch. He was kind, fiercely protective, and deeply devoted to our life together. But David's family was an entirely different species. His mother, Eleanor, and his younger brother, Julian, viewed David not as a son or a brother, but as an endless personal bank account. For as long as I can remember, Eleanor treated our marriage like a temporary inconvenience. In her mind, David belonged to her, and his money belonged to the family empire. When David and I bought our historic craftsman home 7 years ago, Eleanor openly threw a fit because David didn't put Julian's name on the deed, just in case. When Julian failed out of business school and accumulated 6 figures in gambling debts and bad crypto investments, Eleanor expected David to simply write a check and wipe the slate clean. When David refused, pointing out that Julian was a 30-year-old grown man who needed to take responsibility for his own actions, Eleanor labeled me the manipulative whisperer who had turned her sweet boy against his real family. For 12 years, I endured the passive-aggressive comments at holiday dinners. I ignored the subtle insults about my modest background as a high school English teacher. I swallowed the painful realization that they would never accept me. David was my fortress. Whenever his family tried to breach our peace, he stood firmly between us, setting boundaries that kept their toxicity at bay. Then, 6 months ago, the tragedy began. David was diagnosed with an aggressive, late-stage pancreatic cancer. Our world shattered overnight. The months that followed were a blur of sterile hospital rooms, grueling chemotherapy cycles, and quiet, heartbreaking conversations in the middle of the night. While I took a leave of absence from my teaching job to be David's full-time caregiver, managing his medications, bathing him when he grew too weak, and holding his hand through endless nights of agony, his family's behavior turned from selfish to sinister. Eleanor visited the hospital exactly 3 times in 6 months. Each visit lasted less than 20 minutes, and not once did she ask how David was feeling. Instead, she spent those minutes probing. She asked about his life insurance policies. She casually inquired about who was handling his business accounts. She even suggested to David, while he was hooked up to a morphine drip, that he should transfer the ownership of his engineering firm to Julian so the family name wouldn't lose its legacy. Julian was even worse. He showed up to the hospital room once, visibly hungover, asking if he could borrow David's classic 1969 Mustang for a weekend trip. When David quietly told him no, Julian stormed out, muttering that David was selfish even on his deathbed. David wasn't blind. Though his body was failing him, his mind remained razor-sharp until the very end. He saw his family hovering like vultures over a dying man, waiting for the breath to leave his body so they could feast on whatever he left behind. 6 months ago, right after his initial diagnosis, David called his longtime estate attorney and best friend, Marcus. Without telling Eleanor or Julian, David made sure his affairs were locked down in ironclad steel. He knew what his family was capable of, and he knew that once he was gone, I would be left completely unprotected. When David drew his last breath in my arms at 3:15 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, I thought I had experienced the worst pain a human heart could endure. I was wrong. The true nightmare began the morning of his funeral. Alina and Julian arrived at the church dressed in expensive, custom black attire, putting on a masterclass performance of grief for the assembled guests. Alina wept loudly in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief and leaning heavily on Julian, who looked somberly into the crowd as if he were the main character in a tragic movie. They ignored me completely. During the entire service, neither of me spoke a word to me. They didn't offer a hug, a condolence, or even a glance. I was treated like an uninvited spectator at my own husband's memorial. After the graveside service concluded, the guests began to disperse. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, wanting nothing more than to return to the quiet sanctuary of the house David and I had built together. I wanted to sit in his study, smell his cologne on his favorite sweater, and mourn in peace. As I walked toward my car at the cemetery, Julian stepped in front of me. He gave me a cold, patronizing smile. "Don't worry about coming back to the house today, Nicole," Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "Mom and I know how overwhelming this is for you. We've decided to handle the house and David's personal affairs so you don't have to stress. Why don't you go stay at a hotel for a few days?" I stared at him, my grief instantly hardening into suspicion. "What are you talking about, Julian? That is my home." "It was David's home," Julian corrected smoothly, leaning in closer. "And as his real family, we need to secure his assets before things get complicated. Just take a few days, Nicole. We'll be in touch." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward his car, where Alina was waiting in the passenger seat. They sped off, leaving me standing in the cemetery gravel. A sickening feeling bloomed in my chest. I didn't drive to a hotel. I got into my sedan and drove straight home, my heart hammering against my ribs the entire way. When I turned down my street, 20 minutes later, my jaw dropped in utter shock. Parked along both sides of our quiet residential street were dozens of cars. A massive, neon yellow sandwich board was placed at the edge of my driveway reading, "Urgent estate liquidation sale, everything must go, cash only." People were walking down my driveway carrying box fans, framed art, and stacks of David's books. On the front lawn, folding tables were loaded with our kitchenware, our crystal glasses, and David's personal electronics. I pulled my car to a violent halt at the curb. Through the front windshield, I watched two men in work boots carry David's hand-carved oak desk, a piece his late grandfather had passed down to him, out the front door and set it down on the grass. Standing on the porch, holding a pink clipboard and a box of green price stickers, was Alina. Julian was standing near the garage, taking thick stacks of cash from strangers and stuffing them into a leather messenger bag. They hadn't even waited for his body to be cold in the ground. They had organized a vulture auction on my entire life while I was standing at his grave. My hands trembled violently as I reached for my phone. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't march up the driveway to scream or cry. Instead, I dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Nicole. I am returning from my husband's funeral, and there are currently dozens of strangers trespassing on my property, stealing my personal belongings. My in-laws have organized an illegal estate sale on my home. I need law enforcement at this address immediately. Within 7 minutes, the wail of sirens echoed down the street. 2 marked police cruisers pulled up, blocking the driveway, followed shortly by a county sheriff's vehicle. The moment the blue lights began flashing, the atmosphere on the lawn shifted from casual shopping to sudden panic. Alina froze on the porch, her pink clipboard dropping slightly. Julian's head snapped toward the street, his eyes widening as Sheriff Miller, a tall, stern man whom David had known through local community work, stepped out of his SUV. I finally opened my car door. I grabbed the thick manila envelope resting on my passenger seat and walked up the driveway. My posture was straight, my head held high, and my eyes locked onto Alina. "What is the meaning of this?" Sheriff Miller demanded, looking at the tables of personal property and the bewildered crowds of buyers. "Who owns this property?" Alina immediately rushed down the porch steps, her face twisting into an expression of desperate, theatrical panic. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Alina cried, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "This woman is mentally unstable. She's my late son's wife, and she's had a complete emotional breakdown following his death. We are trying to clear out the estate to settle my son's debt before she liquidates everything herself." Julian stepped forward, putting on a calm, reasonable tone. "Sheriff, I'm Julian, David's brother. My brother passed away 3 days ago. This house belonged to him. As his primary surviving family, my mother and I are the legal executors of his estate. We are conducting a preliminary asset sale to pay off his medical expenses. Nicole here is refusing to accept the reality of the situation." The buyers on the lawn began whispering, shifting uncomfortably as they realized they were caught in the middle of a vicious family war. Sheriff Miller turned to me, his brow furrowed. "Nicole, do you live here?" "I have lived here for 7 years, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady, ice cold, and perfectly clear. "This house is my home, and these people are committing grand larceny on my property." "She's lying," Alina shrieked, dropping her fake grief completely. "David bought this house before they were even married. Her name was never on the original deed. This is a family property, and you have no right to a single nail in those walls, you greedy little vulture." "She's right about one thing, Sheriff," Julian added smoothly, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. "Here is a copy of the original 2017 property deed. As you can see, the house was purchased solely under David's name. Under state intestacy laws, since David had no children, his estate defaults to his mother and surviving blood relatives until probate is opened. Nicole has no legal standing to stop this sale." Julian smiled at me, a nasty, arrogant smirk that said I won. They had spent weeks researching legal loopholes, entirely convinced that David's lack of a public will meant they could sweep in and strip me of everything before I could hire a lawyer. They thought they were playing high-stakes chess. They didn't realize David had already flipped the board 6 months ago. I reached into my manila envelope and pulled out a stack of pristine, court-stamped documents. I didn't hand them to Alina or Julian. I handed them directly to Sheriff Miller. "Read page 3, Sheriff," I said quietly. Sheriff Miller unfolded the documents. As his eyes scanned the official notary seals and legal stamps, the silence on that lawn grew heavy enough to crush a mountain. "What is that?" Alina snapped, stepping forward. "Whatever she gave you is a fake. David would never leave her anything. She manipulated him." "This," Sheriff Miller said, his voice dropping into a hard, dangerous register as he looked up from the pages, "is a transfer on death deed, executed and recorded with the county clerk 6 months ago. It automatically transfers full, unencumbered ownership of this property to Nicole immediately upon David's death, bypassing probate court entirely." Alina's face went entirely pale. "What?" "Furthermore," Sheriff Miller continued, flipping to the second document, "this is David's last will and testament, drafted and witnessed by Marcus Vance, attorney at law. Paragraph 4 explicitly states, 'I leave my entire estate, including all real property, personal belongings, financial accounts, and intellectual property, exclusively to my wife, Nicole. I explicitly disinherit my mother, Alina, and my brother, Julian, giving them $0 due to their continuous financial exploitation and lack of familial care during my illness.'" The words hung in the freezing afternoon air like a death sentence. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The leather messenger bag full of cash suddenly looked like an anvil in his hands. "That's a lie," Alina screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "That isn't David's signature. She forged it. She forced him to sign it while he was out of his mind on hospital drugs. I am his mother. I am entitled to his estate." The will was signed in the presence of 2 independent medical doctors who certified David's total mental competency, I said, stepping closer to Alina until I was looking her straight in the eyes. "David knew exactly who you were, Alina. He spent the last 6 months of his life making sure that after he died, you wouldn't be able to steal a single penny from the woman who actually loved him. Sheriff Miller folded the documents and placed them securely back in my envelope. He turned to the 2 deputies standing behind him. "All right, people," Sheriff Miller announced, his voice echoing across the lawn. "This estate sale is officially shut down. Everyone who does not live here needs to drop whatever is in their hands and vacate this property immediately. If you bought something today, take your money back from that man over there with the bag, because every single item on this lawn is stolen property." Panic erupted on the lawn. The buyers, terrified of being caught with stolen goods, began dumping items back onto the tables and rushing toward Julian, demanding their cash back. Strangers were shoving money back into their wallets, shouting at Julian, and hurrying to their cars. Within 5 minutes, the lawn cleared out, leaving only the scattered furniture, the police, Alina, Julian, and me. Julian was sweating profusely, trying to zip his messenger bag shut, but Sheriff Miller stepped in front of him. "Hold on, son," Sheriff Miller said, placing a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. "Hand over that bag. Every dollar in there came from the unauthorized sale of Nicole's property. And while we're at it, you 2 step over to the cruiser." "What?" Alina gasped, clutching her chest. "You're arresting us. We are grieving family members." "You are currently standing on private property conducting an illegal burglary and fence operation," Sheriff Miller said coldly. "Nicole, do you wish to press charges?" I looked at Alina, whose eyes were filled with pure, bitter hatred. I looked at Julian, who was shaking with fear, realizing that his grand scheme to pay off his debts had just turned into a felony indictment. "Yes, Sheriff," I said without a single second of hesitation. "I want to press every single charge available under the law: grand theft, trespassing, and fraud." As the deputies placed handcuffs on Julian and led a hysterical, screaming Alina toward the back of the police car, I stood on my porch and watched them be driven away. They had tried to turn my deepest grief into their personal payday, but David's love had reached out from beyond the grave to snap the trap shut on their greed. Over the next 3 months, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. Because the forensic investigation revealed that Julian had already spent $12,000 of the cash he collected from earlier buyers before the police arrived, he was charged with grand larceny. Combined with his existing financial fraud records, he was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Alina, disgraced and facing massive legal fees to cover her defense in the criminal trespass and property damage lawsuit I filed against her, was forced to put her own home up for sale. The tight-knit community we lived in quickly learned of what she had done, and her social standing dissolved overnight. She became a pariah, completely isolated and drowning in the very financial ruin she had tried to inflict on me. With the help of David's friend Marcus, I liquidated David's engineering firm on my own terms, using the proceeds to establish a charitable foundation in David's name that provides scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing engineering degrees. Today, as I sit on the back porch of the home David protected for me, watching the afternoon sun filter through the trees, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel an overwhelming, profound peace. Standing up to them didn't just protect my home, it honored the love and foresight of the man who cherished me until his very last breath. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you have done if you arrived home from a loved one's funeral to find your in-laws selling your life away? Would you have pressed full criminal charges or walked away to avoid the family drama? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to tell me the city or country you're watching from so I can see how far our story has reached. Thank you for watching until the very end.